Today, we're going to look at a second biblical key to putting everything the last 15 months has done to us behind us. And here is that second key. We have been told to take off our masks. The second biblical key is take off your mask. And that's not about something made of fabric. I'm talking about the mask we may have been hiding our life behind for the last 15 months. The mask hiding what's been going on, really going on, with our marriages and our kids and our emotions and our dysfunctions and our depression. The mask hiding who we have become during this period of time. Some of us are keeping these masks on firmly because we're living in denial. Others because we're choosing to live in secrecy about it. Some of us because we're dealing with enormous guilt or shame over who it is we have become. Some of us because we really do think as long as we keep that mask, that facade in place and the world out and people's knowledge out, it really does cover up whatever it is we've become or done. So the one thing, though, that all mask wearing has in common is this. It doesn't address what's behind the mask. It doesn't solve anything. It doesn't make anything go away. So let's talk about what's behind our mask, because we need it fixed. We need it addressed. Is it an addiction? Is it a broken marriage? Is it conflict in the home? A wayward child? Depression? Are you frequenting sites that you know you shouldn't frequent? Are you going through financial distress? Well, let's go to the Bible to get more insight into this by looking at a story of one of the biggest mask wearers ever. It's a story about a man who made a series of choices from a place of vulnerability, largely as a result of working from home for an extended period of time instead of going to the office. Sound familiar? Well, here's how the story begins. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was. Well, let's just stop there. When kings normally go off to war, which means that when David should have been going off to war, defending his nation, leading his troops, fighting for the cause of his people, he stayed home. A little background here. Kings tended to issues related to the mission of their kingdom during the spring because of the weather of the winter months. But when spring came, that's when kings got to work. That's when you could travel to where you needed to act and needed to represent. It had been about 10 years since David had come to the kingship. It was a time of prosperity, a time of great accomplishment. But instead of going forward, David was cutting back. He was kind of resting on his press reports and riding on his laurels, which means he wasn't doing what he was supposed to be doing. He wasn't attending to what he was supposed to be attending to. Now, unlike many of us, he wasn't forced to work from home. He chose to, but it doesn't matter. He put himself in that context, and the context was the same. For David, it meant that all of the energy, all of that time, all was free to go in other directions and in other ways and in other places. And there would be little accountability. All the soldiers, all the officers were off to war where David should have been. So there wasn't anybody even knowing what he was doing. No sense of, hey, where's David? Or why isn't he here? Or he should be at this meeting or at this gathering or at this event. No, he was at home. He had isolated himself. So instead of his time and energies being disciplined and channeled and accounted for and busy and engaged, he was in a situation where his time and energies were undisciplined and unchanneled and unaccounted for, not busy, not engaged. And that's where it got messy. It can only be called one of the most sordid tales in all of recorded history. The person he sent to find out about the woman taking a bath came back and told him, hey, she's married, and that her husband is actually one of David's officers that was off at war, a man by the name of Uriah. David sent for her anyway. Then he powered up in every way a king could and had her sleep with him. And then he sent her home. Her name was Bathsheba. But she got pregnant from that liaison, what some would call even a rape. We don't know all the details of it, but let's call it a rape because he was in a position of power and authority over her that she couldn't probably handle. So to cover up the pregnancy, he sent for her husband to come home on leave, hoping that he would sleep with her and that the baby would then be seen as theirs. But because no one was allowed to come home, her husband was so honorable that he would not go to be with his wife. Instead, he chose to sleep with the servants of the palace and not enter his home, much less have relations with his wife out of solidarity with his fellow soldiers. So David invited him to a party and tried to get him drunk, hoping that would break down his resistance and he would go home to his wife. That didn't work. So then David sent him back to the army and arranged for him to be stationed at the very front of the lines where his death would be certain. In fact, here was the wording of the order that David gave. He said, "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, then withdraw from him so he will be struck down and die." In other words, he arranged his murder. And that finally worked. And then he married Bathsheba. That was David's COVID. That was his 15 months. That was what happened during his work from home time. That's what was behind his mask. A deeply entrenched shadow life of sin. So what happened next? Well, let's find out. But God was not at all pleased with what David had done and sent Nathan, a prophet, to David. Nathan said to him, "There were two men in the same city, one rich, the other poor. The rich man had huge flocks of sheep, herds of cattle. The poor man had nothing but one little female lamb, which he had bought and raised. It grew up with him and his children as a member of the family. It ate off his plate and drank from his cup, slept on his bed. It was like a daughter to him. One day a traveler dropped in on the rich man. He was too stingy to take an animal from his own herds or flocks to make a meal for his visitor. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared a meal to set before his guest." David exploded in anger. "As surely as God lives," he said to Nathan, "the man who did this ought to be lynched. He must repay for the lamb 4 times over for his crime and his stinginess." "You're the man," said Nathan. So what happened with David and his mask? God took it off. He made him see his life, his actions, his choices, his breakdown. So what was the result of his mask coming off? What kind of effect did it have on David? The Bible tells us, "Then David confessed to Nathan, 'I've sinned against God.'" For the first time, he saw really what was behind the mask, and it broke him in all the right ways. David saw his sin as sin. He owed his sin as sin. He confessed his sin as sin. I don't know what might be behind your mask. I do know that there tends to be 4 kinds of things behind a lot of masks. And I know this through a lot of conversations and a lot of people talking to pastors around here. And there seem to be 4 kinds of things that are become quite common after the last 15 months. Let me see if any of these might be relevant to you. The first is a mask hiding some kind of emotional duress. And for most people, it's depression. And the reason the mask is on when they're feeling this depression is because people tend to erroneously see it as weakness or something that shouldn't be tolerated or allowed to take hold of a life, so they keep their depression a secret. That mask needs to come off, friends. It should come off. It can come off. Depression is nothing to be ashamed of. It's not a spiritual fail or some kind of sin. Clinical depression is one of 4 diseases that physicians call mood disorders. Just as diabetes has to do with the body's failure to regulate blood sugar, disorders related to the mood disorders are a result of a brain's failure to regulate the chemicals that control mood. The way it works is that nerve cells in the brain communicate with each other by releasing chemicals called neurotransmitters, and norepinephrine and serotonin are the 2 neurotransmitters involved in depression. When there is an ample supply of these neurotransmitters available to stimulate other nerve cells, you feel normal emotionally. I mean, you can still have your ups and your downs, but you're not fighting the illness of depression. But in clinical depression, fewer of those neurotransmitters are released because the first nerve cell reabsorbs them before they've adequately stimulated the other nerve cells. Antidepressant medications work because they increase the amounts of norepinephrine or serotonin in the body. The need for antidepressants to address their physical need can be caused by any number of factors, including life circumstances. Any combination of emotional trauma can initiate the chemical changes in the brain that cause depression, including long, sustained seasons of stress, like the last 15 months. So let's just put an end to feeling ashamed of depression or being spiritually self-conscious about it. It is a physical deficiency that can and should be addressed. And if someone is dealing with clinical depression, they need to be on antidepressants for whatever season is needed until they are able to get past it, just like a diabetic needs to be on insulin. It's okay to be depressed. Let me tell you what's not okay: to keep it behind a mask. Well, here's the second thing behind a lot of masks coming off of the last 15 months. Addictions. There are so many kinds of addictions and levels of dependency and gray area relationships with things. So let me just zero in and say we're talking about the life-controlling, life-destroying, all-consuming addictions. It can be pills, it can be porn, it can be gambling, it can be alcohol, it can be food, it can be games. The list is almost endless. The classic definition of a true addiction is the compulsive engagement in something despite wildly adverse consequences. Well, here's the third thing behind a lot of masks: crisis mode living. What I mean by that is during the last 15 months, you've experienced a personal crisis and you've been dealing with this personal crisis and you've been dealing with it alone. You've masked up over it. It could be with one of your children. It could be a financial setback or the toil of unemployment. It could be a medical issue. You had a miscarriage, or maybe you found out you were diagnosed with breast cancer. It could be a marital crisis, even involving emotional or physical abuse, and you don't know what to do. Your mask so needs to come off, and by that I mean you need to be served, and you need to be loved, and you need to be known. You need community, you need friends, you need a family. You need to be able to take off your mask and say, you know, my name is Mary. I have breast cancer and I'm scared to death. My name is Frank. I lost my job and I have no idea how I'm going to care for my family. My name is Jillian. I've got a daughter who's addicted to opioids. And my heart breaks for her, but I am also so emotionally and spiritually exhausted. You know what the church is supposed to be as a family of faith? One of its dynamics. It's supposed to be a place where we can all take off the masks and be strugglers together, to weep and rejoice together, to be brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers to each other. And when this happens, we open the door to the giving and the receiving of love and support and becoming all that God intends us to become. But first, you got to let us know what's going on. You got to let people know what's behind the mask. It reminds me of a story Robert Fulghum once told after bringing up the childhood game hide and go seek. And we all know how you play hide and go seek. And there was often a problem when you played hide and go seek. Someone might have hid too well. Nobody could find him. So the game dragged on. And sooner or later he'd show up mad because everybody had stopped looking for him and everybody else mad at him because he wasn't playing the game the way it should be played, which is, hey, at some point you got to be able to be found. Well, Fulghum then writes of a man who discovered he had terminal cancer. He was a doctor. He didn't want to make his family and friends suffer through his illness with him, so he kept his secret and he eventually died. Everybody said, oh, how brave he was, to bear his suffering in silence and not tell anyone. But his friends and his family didn't feel that way. They were angry that he didn't feel as if he needed them and didn't trust their strength. It hurt them beyond words that he didn't even say goodbye or let them say goodbye. Fulghum writes that he hid too well. Around here, at least, I can't speak for every church, but we say, come on in wherever you are. It's a new game. Hide and go seek is over. It is time to be found. Well, one more thing a lot of people are masking up over, and this is a tricky one, but it's our sin. We're like David. We're not dealing with depression, addiction, crisis. It'd be easier for us to open up maybe if it was. Well, no, for us, it's card-carrying, freely chosen, purposefully embraced sin. We have a deeply entrenched shadow life. And that's the last thing we want to take off our mask and reveal. But can I tell you something as your pastor? Or if you'll let me play the role of pastor, at least for a moment. There's only two ways that's going to play out. The first is what happened with David. God takes your mask off. And the time will come when he will do that for every person. Whether in this life or the one to come, there will be an account. There will be a reckoning. And let me tell you, the one thing you don't want is to be masked before God and have him be the one to reach down and take that mask off. By then, it may be too late. But there's another way this can play out. You take the mask off yourself. And then when you do what David did, because David did one thing right. In that whole mess, he did one thing right. When the mask was taken off, he didn't lie. He didn't resist. He didn't defend. He didn't deflect. He didn't run. He fell on his knees and owned it all. And you can too. In fact, I don't know if you are aware of this. That's what it takes to become a Christ follower, an authentic one. It's to own your sin. And then once owned, to ask God to forgive you for it on the basis of what Jesus did on the cross. You know, a lot of people don't really understand or get what Jesus and the cross was all about. It's really pretty simple. The sins of someone like David, the sin of someone like you, the sin of someone like me, it's serious. More serious than we imagine. The Bible even says that the wages of sin is death. Now, whenever people hear that, the wages of sin is death, that's God's posture. What kind of God is that? A holy one, a just one who cannot react and respond to sin any other way and still be God. But here's what else he is. He's a loving God. And when justice meets love, that's a God who drives a nail into his own hands. He steps in and takes the penalty. He pays the price. It reminds me of something Frederick Buechner once said. He said, like a father who says to a child who's sick, I would do anything to make you well. God looks at all of us sick people and calls his own bluff and does exactly what it would take to make us well, which is to die in our place. So before you think confessing your sin before a holy God is too awkward to imagine, too frightening to envision, too humiliating to consider, oh my goodness, remember this. Jesus died so that you would do just that. And he met, and then have you be met with nothing but love and forgiveness and as many second chances as you need. And if that's what's behind your mask, just this shadow life, no matter what kind of sin or series of sins or family of sins it might be, category of sins, taking your mask off and owning it and receiving forgiveness is everything to you. And it's one prayer away. Whenever I say that to people, I often say, well, what do you mean one prayer away? What is the prayer? All right, let me give you a sample. Here it is. Dear Jesus, I know that I need your forgiveness. I believe you came to earth, died for me, rose again, and now I can have new life. I want to ask you to come into my heart and life. I want to trust you as my forgiver and follow you as my leader. And let me talk about that a minute. What is that prayer? What are you saying? You're saying, I'm owning my sin. I'm asking for God's forgiveness. I'm also owning that, God, you're the only one who can forgive, through what Jesus did. And Jesus, you were God himself in human form, come to earth to die for me and then rise again and offer me a new life too. So here I am, taking you up on it. I am broken, I am beaten, I am bruised. I'm so sick and tired of being sick and tired with this. Doing life on my own and apart from you. Okay, it's over. I need you. I want you. So consider this the invitation. Come into every nook and cranny of my life. Permeate every fiber of my being, heart and life. And I freely, willingly, gladly give you the steering wheel This isn't just about forgiveness. This is about letting you lead, and I so want and need you to lead. Friends, that kind of prayer, prayed sincerely, not only takes the mask off, but it gives you an entirely new face underneath. Because it's the prayer that brings you into the Christ life. That's what becoming a Christ follower, what becoming an authentic Christian is all about. And I unashamedly hope that if you've never prayed that prayer before, that you will. Soon. Maybe even today.